Let me start over because we should have the time, okay? So I'll start over again with that because I didn't really go into a lot of detail yet. Okay. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the difference between drugs and herbs. So, as I already mentioned, the main thing with drugs is you tend to get one active ingredient when you purchase a drug from the pharmacy. There are some situations where you might maybe get a pill that might have, let's say, two or more active ingredients. So if you were to buy let's say, some cold or sinus or flu medication, you may have acetaminophen and a decongestant, and maybe a sympathomimetic in there, all combined together. So you might have two or three active ingredients within a few rare cases, but for the most part, it's limited to one or two or maybe three active ingredients. Now, when you're looking at herbs, because herbs are plants and plants contain hundreds or thousands of phytochemicals, you're going to have a lot of different compounds in that, and those compounds may or may not have a therapeutic effect. For example, you may have flavonoids in there that may have an antioxidant effect, so it may be a secondary action, or you could have phytochemicals that exert, let's say, may have an antibiotic-like effect, while other compounds in there work by a different mechanism to have an antibiotic effect. And so there's more potential for lots of things going on when you're involving a herb. Now, this is kind of fascinating, interesting in theory, but there are some challenges with this. Now, one of those challenges is the quality of the product. So when you buy a drug, I would say for the most part, you're pretty much going to be guaranteed to get a 99.9% or a 99% pure product in the end. And so when you buy a pill, it should contain that active ingredient and nothing else on there. And the FDA and the Health Canada, they make the rules pretty strict for drug companies when they're manufacturing pills. Now, when it comes to herbs, one of the problems is if you buy a product, assuming that you have the right plant in there, there is no guarantee that the active ingredient is going to be at the right level that you want it at. And so if you were to buy, let's say, a particular plant, it may be that it was grown in a region that isn't really the best area to grow that plant, or it may be that they picked it at the wrong time of year, or they used the wrong part of the plant. And so the active ingredient within the plant, within the herb, could vary from batch to batch. And even if it's grown, even if it's a good product and they've been growing up for decades, it could just be 1 year because of drought, or because there's less sunshine, that those desirable phytochemicals may be greater or less than the previous year. And so it's not unlike, if you look at wine, there are good years, like the same winery could have 2005 was a great year for Riojas in Spain, that type of red wine. And those are some of the best ones. 2006 just wasn't quite as good. And in that case, both years will get you drunk, but the antioxidants or the desirable flavors in there won't necessarily be the same. So that's one thing. The other issue with quality is that it's also possible for manufacturers to accidentally or intentionally adulterate the product so that there could be the wrong herb in there, or there could be, when they're harvesting the plants, maybe some of the wrong plants get in there, and that could be totally benign, but just basically reduce the potency of the plant, or it could be actually dangerous, and maybe the plant that gets adulterated in there accidentally could be poisonous or toxic in some way. So that's one of the challenges when it comes to herbs, is that the quality, it's hard to know you're going to be getting the same quality. And in the past, herbalists, they gathered the plants, they knew where to get the plants from, but you're kind of trusting the individual doing the harvesting is going to do the right job, and that Mother Nature is cooperating as well. So that doesn't mean you can't do it. You shouldn't use herbs. It just means there are some little challenges with it. The other issue with herbs is that they're harder to research, and so because from batch to batch the active ingredients can change, it can be a little discouraging for researchers because they can't necessarily predict what's going to happen from one batch to the next batch. And so sometimes researchers and doctors might refer to herbs as being dirty drugs. You know, they're not clean, they're not refined, you know. And sometimes I think people like to have high quality, pure, refined products, you know, but that's not always a good thing. So if you look at, if you want to have a pure energy source, you know, you could eat just white sugar all the time. You know, it's very, very pure. It's not going to be as good for you as a piece of fruit that contains sugar and other things. Now, another thing is how strong or how potent the plants are. And I think I mentioned this probably in the first lecture, is that in general, drugs are pretty potent, pretty powerful things. And the analogy I gave last time is if you're an archaeologist trying to uncover some ancient ruins, you can use a powerful tool like a bulldozer. But those bulldozers are more likely to cause damage to the structure. And our bodies are pretty delicate. So when you use drugs, yes, they're powerful, but you're more likely to get side effects. And although herbs are generally less potent, they tend to have less side effects. And I would say the herbs that I use on a daily basis are pretty safe. They work good. They work pretty well. But they're not going to be as powerful as some of the drugs on the market. So a herb that I might use for, let's say, as a sleep aid, valerian or passion flower or something like that, it's a very gentle herb. So if you were to drink, let's say, 100 cups of it, you're not going to suddenly be knocked unconscious. While if you were taking a benzodiazepine or a barbiturate drug or something like that, they're quite potent. And in some cases, you could take too much and basically suffer from amnesia and blackout. Other things like barbiturates, they could cause death if you overdosed on them. So with the average person who's having difficulties falling asleep at night, they may only need just a little cup of herbal tea, a little bit of chamomile before bed, may just help to take the edge off a bit and help them fall asleep. So there's benefits or pros of having something that's not as potent because it's less toxic and less dangerous. Now, another thing that's worth mentioning is that when you develop drugs, the pharmaceutical companies, they're running businesses, and there's nothing wrong with running a business. The problem is that they need to create products that they can patent so they can have exclusive rights to sell it for, I don't remember what it is, if it's 5 years or 10 years or whatever it is. So they have to be able to patent it. And so the research that's being done in conventional medicine is primarily done on drugs that can be patented because the drug companies are the ones paying for the research. And one of the challenges with herbs is I can't put a patent on chamomile. So if I find out that chamomile tea is good for, let's say, anxiety or for insomnia, and I spend $100,000 or $1 million researching it to prove this and doing several clinical trials and lots of safety trials, if I went through the same rigor that people go through to approve a drug and I did it on chamomile, I would need millions of dollars. And so the problem is that because you can buy chamomile anywhere, no one's necessarily going to buy my chamomile product. And so as a result, I'll never be able to get my money back that I've dumped into the research. So that's a challenge with herbs, is that there isn't the financial incentive for people to research it. Unless they're going to figure out a way they can research it, extract the active ingredient. And in some cases, what you can do is modify that active ingredient. So if you have a phytochemical that's been shown to be beneficial for inflammation, like let's say curcumin, which you find in turmeric, and if you were to take the curcumin molecule and add a few carbons here or there to it, you could make it less potent or more potent, I don't know, but you could then patent it. Now you'd have to go through a series of FDA approvals or Health Canada approvals to ensure that it was safe and effective and everything else, but you could have that patentable then. So herbs in their purest form or unpure forms, you cannot basically patent it. You can only isolate an active ingredient and alter it. Now, it's possible that you could take a proprietary blend of herbs, So if you were to combine chamomile, peppermint, valerian, and you research that particular formula, you might be able to patent that formula and call it, Dr. Gowan's relaxation mixture, and get a patent for that formula. That might be possible. And then you could do your research on that. But it would have to be very precise, like 1-to-1, equal parts of each one, or something like that. So I'm not a patent lawyer, so I don't know all the details, but there is ways you can do it. But like I said, there's not the same financial incentive as you would if you're developing a drug. Now, another thing that's interesting about the difference between drugs and herbs is many drugs and herbs have the same medicinal properties. So there are certain terms or actions that exist when talking about medicine. So, for example, if someone has a urinary tract infection, you might want to give them a diuretic. You might want to give them an antibiotic or an antibacterial. Diuretics and antibacterials exist both in the pharmaceutical world and also in the herbal world. And so things like antihypertensive, anti-inflammatories, these are all terms that if you use these to discuss a case or a plant or a herb or whatever it is to a medical doctor, they would understand that language. But then there are also, in the herbal world, there are certain actions that don't exist in the pharmaceutical or the drug world. So things like an adaptogen, we'll talk about later today, helps the body cope with stress. That particular substance doesn't really exist in the pharmaceutical world. Another thing is an alterative, and this is an action that basically refers to a substance that helps to cleanse the blood. And so it's used for detoxification, it's used for skin disorders, a number of other things like that. That doesn't really exist in the pharmaceutical world. Phytoestrogens, plant-based estrogens, we're going to talk about those later on. They don't really exist in the pharmaceutical world, although I think most people have heard of that term. So those are just some basic little differences that I see between herbs and drugs. And that doesn't mean that drugs are better or herbs are better. It just means they're different. And I think that in some cases, when I look at this list of various things, there are times where you want to have a drug that's very precise with one active ingredient, especially when you're dealing with toxic substances. You don't want to be off by 50%. When it comes to chamomile tea, because it's so safe, you could have a product that is the active ingredient. Maybe it's 30% less or 40% more, but because when it comes to herbs, most of the herbs that we use are the dose is quite broad that you can use. So you could use anywhere between 1 and 6 cups of chamomile tea a day safely and effectively. 1 will do the trick. 3 will also do the trick. When you're dealing with certain drugs like statin drugs, for example, that to lower cholesterol, or you're dealing with certain heart medications, if you're off by 30%, maybe 50%, you could cause death in the patient. So there are times where we need to be very precise. We want to have that one active ingredient, and so there's a place for that. But herbs also have a place in healthcare. Oh, there's a fire truck going by. I'm just going to check my questions. So, have you patented a herbal remedy? No, I have not patented a herbal remedy. It's an awful lot of effort that I wouldn't bother. I'm not in the business of selling herbal products on a large scale. So certainly, if I had a lot of money, I've got lots of great ideas, and I'm sure you guys all have great ideas too. But you realize that you could have 100 good ideas, but you may only have time to actually work on one of those ideas, or maybe 2 or 3 if you're lucky. But so that's something that in a parallel universe, I'd love to have a herbal company and develop products and patents and formulas that I've developed and research and stuff like that. That would be awesome. That would be like a dream, but that's not for this life of mine. So any other questions before I move on? We're good. Okay. So when it comes to herbal medicine and research, I find it really interesting that we've used herbal medicine for however many thousands and thousands of years. effectively, but the research is only emerging in the last really 50 years. And so I went on to PubMed, and this isn't very accurate. So the fact that we've been using herbal medicine for 30,000 years, but when you look at the published research in PubMed, if you type in, I can't remember what I searched for, like I searched in botanical medicine or herbal medicine or herbs or something into PubMed, and this doesn't cover all natural products and herbal formulas. And you can see that in the 40s, basically, there was really not a lot of published research on it. I'm sure there was research, but it wasn't in PubMed because PubMed probably didn't even exist then, and the internet didn't exist in the 80s. So, but what's interesting now, you can see how research is growing exponentially on the topic, and that's what I'm trying to say. And if you look at 2017, it's probably doubled since then. I would guess. I haven't done it, and so we're at the kind of on the exponential curve going on. So even when I was a student at the college and I graduated, like I started in the 1990s and I graduated in 2003, there was some research and there was some good research, but there wasn't tons. And what's interesting, if you look at the 1970s, when I would say, I don't know when the naturopath started in Canada, like as the colleges and everything else, but let's say in the 70s, the class sizes were relatively small. And back then, most of the naturopaths, or most of the people who wanted to become naturopaths, they weren't doing it because the research supported it. They did it because they believed in it and they had faith in the powers of nature, and they had a distrust for drugs. And so we kind of needed those people in the 70s to form the profession. And what's interesting now is I would say in order for our profession to continue to grow and become more credible, we need more and more research into what we're doing, and which is good because it is happening. But the general public, they do want some research to back stuff up. And we kind of balance the traditional indications of the herbs and the research that exists for it. And there is a lot of research, and there are certain herbs that I would say the research is outstanding for it, including like St. John's wort, where from an evidence-based model, this should be the first-line therapy for different types of depression. And it's a great herb. But that's only one of hundreds of herbs that I use. There's a number of other herbs that have a handful of maybe in vitro trials, which means basically it occurs in a test tube, so you're just using cell cultures or maybe bacteria, but you're not actually doing it with humans. In vivo means it's done on animals. Clinical trials are done on humans, a different type of animal. So I would say the majority of the herbs that I use in my practice have either zero or little research to support it. And what I mean by that is some of the herbs have zero clinical trials, and I use them every single day, like certain digestive bitters. There are other herbs that might have a couple clinical trials, might have a few in vivo trials. The research is starting to basically to support what we've known for thousands of years. But from an evidence-based standpoint, it would be impossible to practice medicine exclusively by research. You'd be limited to a handful of herbs probably. So in my opinion, appreciate the traditional indications and have a keen interest in looking at the new research that's coming out. And where research is really useful is especially when it comes to drug interactions, safety things during pregnancy. That's where I think the research is really useful. And it's just really nice when I find a clinical trial has been performed that supports something that I've been doing for years, which I really appreciate. So someone's saying that they can't hear. Rashida is saying that. Can everyone else confirm that you can hear me? Or just a couple people even? So Rashida, that's maybe turn up the volume on your computer, check your speakers, check your headphones. That's on your end, not on our end. Any other questions? Because everyone's saying. Um, so Lauren was asking, so when it comes to research, I'm sure you guys will take a research course, vitro means glass. So in vitro means test tube studies. Those are usually done with bacteria and cells. In vivo means in life. So those trials are usually done in rats, could be rabbits, could be monkeys, some kind of animal they're using. And that's what the difference. So vitro is glass, vivo is living. Just as an aside, somebody could not hear us. Maria offered a suggestion. If you get into a situation where you can't hear it, log out of the webinar and then re-log back in. So it could just be a glitch on the computer, and sometimes that's what you got to do. Just log out, re-log in, okay? And somebody was saying, Lauren was also adding, saying that in vivo, when she looked up, when she Googled it, includes humans, and that makes sense. Usually when I think of in vivo trials, I'm usually thinking of just lab animals, but you know, technically speaking, humans are animals, so that would encompass them as well. Now, a lot of people, I think sometimes people think that plants, that herbs don't work, or herbs, you know, they're not very effective or not very powerful. But the majority of drugs in the past were developed from herbs. And there's an interesting little story about a drug called artemisinin. And this kind of helps to illustrate the whole evidence-based model. And by following one herb, you can appreciate what we know about a plant and how long it takes to get approved and used by the general public. Most of the photographs in the slides are taken by me, but not all of them. And I just like, this is from National Geographic, and I really, really like this picture. This is a picture of somewhere in Africa, Tanzania, where they're now growing Chinese wormwood and using it to treat malaria because they don't have access to the drugs, or they're trying to find a more cost-effective way to do it. And so not only is it a beautiful picture, but I think it's pretty cool that there are countries in the world that are going to use plants to solve their problems as opposed to just using drugs. Now, artemisinin is an anti-malarial drug, and what's interesting about this is it comes from Chinese wormwood. And in Chinese medicine, I don't even want to try to pronounce it, the Latin name is Artemisia annua. So there are different wormwoods. There's Artemisia absinthium, which is used in Western herbalism more as a parasitic herb. A lot of the wormwoods have activity against parasites. Some of them against worms, some of them against malaria. And malaria is a type of parasite as well. We'll talk about it more in a second. And what's really interesting from the history standpoint is at about 200 BC, we have recorded use of this in Chinese textbooks, where they would use it for various things. And some of the early indications, they may not have known what malaria is, but they knew what the symptom picture was. And I think they may have referred to it as like summer heat, where people have alternating hot and cold fevers, and they may have other symptoms associated with it. And so we knew about it for thousands of years. And then in the 1960s, the Chinese government / military at the time was trying to find new anti-malarial drugs. And so they were doing basically some in vitro trials, some little test tube trials with some crude extracts from a number of plants to see whether they possess some anti-malarial properties. And so they found that one worked. So then after the 60s, they basically eventually did a clinical trial that was published in, and they may have been doing trials or experiments in China, but it was in 1984 that the first good randomized controlled trial was performed with artemisinin, the actual drug, and they found it to be effective, and it was published in The Lancet, which is a very well-respected medical journal. And then over the next basically 20 years, if you're looking at it, lots and lots of clinical trials, systematic reviews, more trials were done. with artemisinin and basically combinations of this particular anti-malaria with other ones. And it wasn't until 2005 that it was finally developed or finally approved by the World Health Organization to be the first-line drug against chloroquine-resistant malaria. And so this is probably one of the most effective drugs for resistant malaria. And what's fascinating about it is the fact that we've used this, or not we, but civilizations around the world have used this herb for 2,000 years. But it took a long time before human trials were done. And the other thing that I want to mention, oops, let me go back here, is that it wasn't until about, I would say probably in the 90s, 1990s, there was enough evidence that this should have been adopted by policymakers at the time. Like there was enough evidence, but even when there was sufficient evidence, so people are dying. When you have a drug that works for malaria, but policymakers haven't told everyone they should be using this, people are dying from malaria around the world from this. And so even after it was shown to be effective probably in the 90s, it still took another 10 years for people to get their act together and hundreds of trials before it was actually adopted by the policymakers. And so I appreciate the fact that if you move on, I'm going to skip ahead here, you can see there's hundreds, if not thousands of trials done on this. And at least hundreds before it gets adopted. And so if a plant that we're using, some herb we're using, only has 1 or 2 clinical trials, most medical doctors and researchers would say there isn't enough research to use it. But if we wait till there is enough research, people could be dying or not getting the benefits from that plant as well. So now if you're just curious how artemisinin works, I always, out of curiosity, I always like to know how things work. When you have the malaria parasite, what it does is it infects red blood cells, and hemoglobin is used to make your red blood cells. And when it gets broken down, it generates free heme. Now, heme has an iron molecule inside of it, and when iron comes in contact with peroxides in the body, so our bodies produce hydrogen peroxide, for example, and when this compound gets produced, it's a relatively unstable compound, and in the presence of free heme, the iron will allow it to generate free radicals and it can be toxic. So what the malaria parasite does is it uses something called heme polymerase, which is an enzyme that basically forms crystals or polymers of these free heme molecules to sequester them to make them safe. So what's interesting about the artemisinin is it's a phytochemical that contains a peroxide molecule on it, and it has a little peroxide bridge. Now I'm going to show it to you. Is this here is the peroxide bridge. This is a relatively unstable structure, and so when it comes in contact with iron, it will become a free radical. So you'll see it'll basically throw some free radicals around, and this artemisinin radical here is now able to interact with various membranes or proteins or DNA and basically disrupt the function. And so because it's relatively unstable, it's going to be more or less contained within the malarial parasite and cause local damage and cause death there. Now, just as an aside, that's another little interesting thing about the story is that in Chinese medicine, they also knew that in order to perform preparations or to extract the active ingredients, they wouldn't boil this in hot water for hours. Like they wouldn't do that type of extraction. They actually knew that you want to warm the water up to do the extraction, but you don't want to heat it to boiling, otherwise it inactivates the active ingredient. And that's because these peroxide molecules are relatively susceptible to damage from heat. And so by making like a warm water extraction, you'll get the active ingredients. And it's interesting because when you look at some of the research that was done on the herb, I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but I know there's at least one drug company or one study that was done where they basically showed that the herb was ineffective. So you couldn't just make a tea out of the herb because it was ineffective against malaria. And so therefore you had to buy the drugs and take the drugs for it to be effective. And that may be because they were basically, the extraction process damaged the active ingredient. So that's just a little interesting little story about artemisinin. There's not a lot of questions on the exam, but Question: are we responsible for remembering names such as Artemisia annua or chemical structures of these drugs? You certainly will not have any images or pictures on the drugs. The Latin names and the common names, I think they'd be fair game for the exam. Most of the things, I would say, if not everything that I'm going to be testing, will basically be on the slides. And what I'm talking about is to create a story around it and help you remember the information that's on the slides. So things that come out of my mouth, you won't necessarily need to know that. So I kind of went off on an aside with the artemisinin and boiling and everything else. That's just interesting stuff, but you can forget it for the exam if you want to. But yes, I'd say anything on the slides is fair game. So there's a question. I believe Al is asking, what is so special about the Chinese wormwood compared to the Artemisia absinthium wormwood? What's special about it is there are two different plants that produce two different types of phytochemicals. And so the Artemisia absinthium doesn't have these peroxide-like compounds, and these are peroxide sesquiterpene lactones we'll talk about later on. While the Artemisia absinthium, which we use in Western herbalism, and it targets more worms, it doesn't have that same structure. It's a totally different compound. So I'm sure the Chinese wormwood might work for parasites like worms, but I don't think, and if it does, I don't think Artemisia absinthium, the normal common wormwood, would work for malaria. It might, but the research doesn't support it, and it wasn't used traditionally for that, so I wouldn't really use that. So every plant makes different little compounds. They have their own little factories. Somebody wants me just to go over the artemisinin. The way that we think the artemisinin works is that because the artemisinin is a peroxide molecule, when it comes in contact with the iron in free heme, the free heme and the iron will basically generate free radicals with the artemisinin and other peroxides. And then the artemisinin radical, this compound here, can directly bind to DNA, proteins, and disrupt cellular function within the cell. Also, some of the other free radicals that get generated can oxidize, cause free radical damage to like cell membranes and everything else, just through forming hydroxyl molecules and things. So again, this is kind of the timeline for the research done on artemisinin. And you can see in the 90s, there's lots and lots of data here, but it still took all this before it was approved. Now, one of the other things that's interesting about artemisinin is that it's not allowed. So the World Health Organization, because this is kind of like a life-saving drug, that's one of the problems with malaria as it's on the rise, is that people are dying from it because the old drugs aren't working, because parasites and bugs and bacteria and viruses, they're pretty smart. Eventually, they'll figure out a way to overcome the drug. And so if right now malaria overcomes artemisinin, we won't have an effective treatment for it. So right now, in order to overcome the drug resistance, they will give artemisinin in combination with a couple other drugs, and that work by different mechanisms, and that can help to ensure that the parasites can't mutate fast enough to become resistant to all three drugs simultaneously. And I think this is the way of the future with antibiotics. And we'll talk about another example later on about this, which is kind of fascinating. So now there's some other things that we're going to look at, some other drugs from plants. So artemisinin is just one, and it just has a nice little story to it. Another antimalarial drug is quinine. Now, quinine was probably the first antimalarial drug used in the West. So artemisinin was used in Asia, and I would say quinine, and in particular cinchona bark, was what was used in Western herbalism. And it was first used by indigenous people in, I would say, the northwest area of South America, so Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, And it's a large tree that grows and produces an alkali called quinine. And it was in about the 1500s where the Jesuit priests were in South America doing whatever they're doing. And they made note of the fact that the indigenous people were using this to treat malaria. And so they introduced it to Europe. And then those extracts were being used in Italy and other European countries in the 17th century. And then eventually chemists would do an extraction to get the quinine out. And the quinine is the one main active ingredient. Now, just as an aside, there may be other compounds that have biological activity in there, but they could take the quinine out and administer that in kind of a drug form where they control the dose of it. Because quinine's a relatively toxic substance. It's not really a good thing to have in high amounts. Many side effects associated with it. But quinine was basically the first-line drug for malaria all the way to about the 40s. And when British soldiers were in Africa doing whatever they were doing there, a lot of them would be given quinine. And because it's so bitter, it's one of the most bitter substances, they would add sweeteners to it and soda to it. And this is sort of how tonic water was developed. So when you buy tonic water for, let's say, a gin and tonic, it contains quinine in it, a really bitter compound, as well as high fructose corn syrup, because it's quite sweet, even though there's a predominant bitter taste that comes over. And so tonic water, which I don't know a lot of people that like it, does contain actual quinine, but it's in really tiny amounts. So you're not going to get, one, you can't treat malaria using tonic water. You'll get diabetes before you get rid of the malaria because of all the sugar in it. And two, because the dose is so low, it doesn't actually have any anti-malarial properties to it, and it doesn't actually, also doesn't have the toxic properties. However, quinine still, from a herbal standpoint, even in small amounts, can act as a digestive bitter. So tonic water is used as a digestive tonic to stimulate digestion. And so a gin and tonic is used to promote digestion. We'll talk about this more in the second half of the course. So after about the 1940s, other chloroquine anti-malarias were developed that were as effective but had less toxic side effects. So currently, the World Health Organization puts quinine on the list of one of the essential medicines, and there's a number of them that are on that. But it's no longer the primary drug. But in some drug-resistant strains, quinine still gets used because it's cheap and widely available. But again, it's toxic. It's not the main one. The goal of developing new drugs is, can you develop a drug that's less toxic? Now, less toxic and more effective. Now, one thing I'd be curious to see is if cinchona bark was taken where you have a mixture of phytochemicals, I wonder if it would be safer and just as effective than taking high amounts of just the quinine alone. Another thing with quinine, just in case you're curious, it's been used for some off-label indications, like for certain types of arrhythmias and also for leg cramps. It's sort of an unusual indications for it, but it's not just used for malaria. Now, I like mechanisms. I'm not going to give you guys a lot of these, but one of the ways that we believe that quinine works is, I showed you this little picture before. So the artemisins generate peroxides, and these peroxides basically can cause damage. Now, what quinine does, it doesn't directly generate the peroxides, but what it does is it inhibits the enzyme heme polymerase that's responsible for taking this toxic free heme that generates free radicals and forming these polymers that are safe. And so the quinine basically inhibits this, this enzyme so that there's going to be more free heme floating around inside the parasite, and this now generates more free radicals and cause toxic effects. So here's a way that you can have two anti-malarial herbs that work by two different mechanisms. And this is interesting because a lot of time in herbal medicine, I wouldn't just give one herb alone. I often will combine, sometimes I do, but often I'll combine them with other herbs in hopes that you have multiple actions making it effective. And we'll go back to this later on in a second. Now, another drug, you guys probably have all heard of foxglove. Foxglove's a pretty plant that grows in a lot of people's gardens. And it's the source of a compound called digoxin. Oh, well, let's go back. You can see the digoxin on yours. I don't know. I upgraded my keynote, so there's something funny with the formatting. Now, foxglove was used in Western herbalists by Western herbalists for conditions like dropsy, which basically is swelling and edema of the ankles, which is caused by congestive heart failure. And back in the 1700s, the conventional doctors didn't really have a whole lot they could give patients for this. And William Withering was a medical doctor at the time who saw a patient with dropsy and said, sorry, there's nothing I can do for you. And the patient went off and talked to the local herbalist, and local herbalist gave him foxglove, and then the patient came back and told Dr. Withering, oh, I'm all better. Look, I got this plant from the herbalist. And so William Withering gets all the credit for discovering it, although he had nothing to do with it. He couldn't help his patient. The local herbalist did, whose name didn't get recorded in history. But that's the way these things go. So usually the herbalists and the First Nations people don't get the credits. The scientists or the doctors that discover it. Now with digoxin, it's also recognized. It's on the list, the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. So it's fallen out of favor a bit recently for congestive heart failure and some other conditions, but it's still there. And the way that it works is it works as a positive ionotropic and a negative chronotropic substance. And so what that means is positive ionotropic means that it increases the influx of calcium ions into the cardiac muscles, so it increases the contraction of the force of contractions of the heart, while it slows down the heart rate. So negative chronotropic, chrono refers to time, so it makes the heart beat slower and increases the contraction, so you get a much more efficient pump from that. So ionotropic refers to ions like calcium, chronotropic refers to time. That's just a little side note. It also acts as a diuretic through that mechanism, other things. And that's the main thing. So it's an interesting plant. This would be a fairly dangerous plant. You wouldn't want to go and mess around with it. I wouldn't give this to a patient. I would prefer to give this to a patient as a drug, where you can know the precise dose and everything else, but it certainly was used in herbal medicine. And when you have something like congestive heart failure, which poses a lot of risks and it can be kind of dangerous, you're better off using a dangerous plant than using no plant at all. So there's a digoxin. Now it disappeared. Hopefully it's on your notes. So another important drug is ephedrine. So ephedrine and pseudoephedrine, which is very similar in structure. You can find these at the local drugstore, pharmacy. It's an ingredient in a lot of sinus medication and cold and flu medication. And it's been used in herbal medicine for thousands of years. As I mentioned in the first lecture, it was used by the ancient Egyptians. They used it as like a bronchodilator for asthma. It's also used in Chinese medicine in a number of their formulas for upper respiratory tract infections. We've used it in Western herbalism. It's used in the Middle East. All over the world it's used in herbal medicine. The way that it works is it basically acts as a sympathomimetic, and what that means is it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. And so if you were to inject someone with adrenaline, you would have the bronchioles dilate, you'd have the heart rate goes up, the pupils will dilate, a number of other things that'll happen. And ephedrine, it kind of acts like epinephrine and norepinephrine, like adrenaline, but because the structure is different, I don't know if it's going to show me the structure. That's annoying. I'm just going to do this for a second. Because of the structure is different, it lacks a couple of little OH groups on this ring here that epinephrine or norepinephrine has. And so what ends up happening is ephedrine, it doesn't get cleared from the body as quickly. So when you look at epinephrine or norepinephrine, if you get a shot of adrenaline because you almost got in a car accident, you'll feel that burst of energy for seconds, maybe minutes. And then it's sort of, your body will break it down very quickly and get rid of it. Ephedrine, because the structure is different, it's slower to kick in because you're taking it orally, and it's broken down by different mechanisms, the ephedra and epinephrine, norepinephrine. Sorry, yeah, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So it remains in the body rather than for minutes. It remains in the body for hours. So it's more gentle on the system. So other actions that it has a decongestant effect because it causes vasoconstriction in the capillaries in the nose, so that you have less edema and swelling going into the nasal passageways. So when people get nasal congestion, for example, that's usually not that there's phlegm in the nose primarily, but rather that the mucous membranes are swollen and inflamed because the water is sort of leaking in there and causing edema. And then also, as I mentioned before, it acts as a bronchodilator, so it can help with open up the airways to get it so that people can breathe. Now, ephedrine also is included on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicine. And so you'll find that being used, I think most people have probably used it at some point. Now, as an aside, the FDA and Health Canada, they kind of have I don't know if it's fully banned, but it's certainly banned for weight loss. And one of the problems that people have used is for weight loss because it stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, increases metabolism. So if you're taking it long term, you'll actually lose a lot of weight. The problem is for weight loss, if you weigh 350 pounds, you've got diabetes, you've got high cholesterol, you've got high blood pressure, ephedra will help you lose weight, but the problem is it could also cause a lot of harm, and some people, there have been deaths reported with people taking ephedra for weight loss purposes and having a heart attack and dying. So in herbal medicine, it's very safe when you use it as indicated, but when you're using it for weight loss, it's not safe, and so there's been bans on it in both Canada and the US for weight loss products, but it's still available for like colds and flus and other herbal products. Sorry, I'm trying to, I don't know why my builds are, I'm gonna have to switch it to this mode. For some reason, my slides, the formatting's gotten all messed up for the way it's playing. So I think most people have heard that aspirin, it comes from willow bark, and that's not entirely true. Now, historically, willow bark was used for a number of things, including arthritis, aches and pains. It's also used for fevers. The main active ingredient in willow bark is salicylic acid, and salicylic acid is found in a number of other herbs. So it's not just willow bark that contains it. Salicylic acid can be found in a number of fruits and vegetables in small amounts as well. But certainly willow bark has very high amounts of it. One of the things is when it comes to aspirin is that in the 1800s, there was a chemist who basically took salicylic acid and he combined it with an acetyl group. And so he made what's called acetyl salicylic acid. And acetylating chemicals is a very simple thing to do in chemistry. And so they're even doing it in the 1800s. And you'll look at like a lot of, let's say, vitamins, like vitamin E when you bought it. You usually don't get alpha tocopherol. Often you'll get like acetyl tocopherol. They've added an acetyl group on the OH group. And so if you remove this acetyl group here, you'll just have basically a little OH group on here. And that's what salicylic acid is, just this without the acetyl group. Now, the benefit of adding the acetyl group is it made it a little less damaging to the stomach. And so aspirin, which is still hard on your stomach, is not as bad as giving salicylic acid alone. And in the 1800s, or I guess 1900s, Bayer started selling aspirin as a drug, and so it's a purified form. And it's now included on the list of the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. And so what's interesting about this is the drug has been modified slightly from its natural source. So acetyl salicylic acid does not exist in nature, to the best of my knowledge anyways. It's been modified by chemists to produce this aspirin because it basically is, actually that would be patentable by doing that, and also it would be a little bit safer than just doing the salicylic acid alone. I'd be curious to see if willow bark, and I don't know if willow bark, if you're doing it in the therapeutic amounts, if it would cause the same risk of stomach ulcers as giving aspirin or giving salicylic acid alone. Sometimes plants have more protective things in there to help with ulcers, so, but I don't know. So there's another example, and one more compound I want to talk about is Tamiflu. Oh, that's annoying. So Tamiflu, it's an antiviral drug, and you may have heard that when there's a SARS epidemic and there's a risk of swine flu and a number of these other flu pandemics, countries were basically stockpiling Tamiflu. And so Tamiflu is a very unique drug. It's not found in nature, and I want to emphasize that. It's not a naturally occurring drug. It was made in a lab by chemists. But they do use plants to make this. And so shikimic acid, which is shown in the bottom left there, it's in certain types of plants, it's used as an intermediate to form amino acids. And so this can be found in really high amounts in certain plants, including star anise, but it's not the only herb for it. Star anise has a shikimic acid. So if you're a chemist, you don't want to, it's like, imagine if you're trying to build a spaceship out of Lego. If you have to just do it with, you know, one block at a time, it's very, very challenging. If you can already, you know, basically get a structure that's already pre-made for you, and then you just have to sort of add and remove various things, it'll save you a lot of time and money. And so basically pharmaceutical drugs will often use plants to obtain raw ingredients that they can use to as a starting place to make drugs from. So shikimic acid, it does not have the antiviral properties associated with Tamiflu, but it's quite easy. It's a matter of, like, just looking at that structure there, there's like maybe 5 reactions you have to do to make Tamiflu, as opposed to starting from scratch and having to make like 100 reactions. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is I know that sometimes herbalists or naturopaths may be like, oh, well, Tamiflu is found in star anise, so you can just give star anise and it'll have antiviral properties and that'll be good. And I would say that's not necessarily the case. So you can't compare Tamiflu to star anise. You can't just use the herb as a replacement for it, because the herb doesn't contain that active ingredient. And even then, star anise doesn't really have a lot of traditional indications for as an antiviral that I know of. Probably has a little bit, but not a lot. So now, one final drug that we'll talk about, and this is a unique example, is Taxol. And so Taxol is a very complex molecule that's found in the Pacific U. And this herb and this compound was never used historically in herbal medicine. And the way that it was discovered in the 1970s, the National Cancer Institute was doing research, and basically they take thousands of different plants and put them in little test tubes or little vials and check to see if they have any activity against cancer cells. And Taxol was one of the basically compounds or drugs that was extracted and was shown to be highly effective against a whole bunch of different types of cancers, including breast cancer and uterine cancer. And so what's interesting about this, they found this by screening plants in the wild. So herbalists never realized that this was beneficial for cancer. But the problem with Taxol is that there's a couple of issues with it. One, there's a very complex structure. And so if you look at the structure of this, as a chemist, this would be very, very difficult to make in a lab. And in chemistry, you've got what are called chiral centers. So when you have 4 things attached to a carbon, you can get different isomers of it. So you can get like a right-sided version and a left-sided version. And so there's a whole bunch of those on this compound, just looking at it quickly. And so that means every time I try to make, like this might take 30 steps. So every step, if I hit a chiral center, I will get a certain amount of right and a certain amount of left hands from it. And I have to throw away the left hand. So you might start off with, let's say, a ton of starting material. And by the time you've made it, every step you're going to lose some product, and every chiral center you're going to lose a whole bunch of it, like 50% or so. So in the end, if you start off with a ton of active ingredients, you may only end up with only a few milligrams or a few grams of drug that you could sell. And so there's a lot of waste. And so the first issue is very hard to synthesize in a lab. And then the second problem is that they realize that the amount of Taxol in Pacific U wasn't that high, and the problem was that the demand for this drug would be very high and the supply would be very low. So if they basically harvested the Pacific U's in order to meet the demands, they eradicate the population in just a couple of years, and then nobody would be able to get access to it. So here was a big challenge where they couldn't make it and they couldn't get it from the wild. And so then eventually, I don't remember exactly when it happened, I think it was in the 80s, maybe 90s even, with biotechnology, what they're eventually able to do is they were able to get little cell cultures and using biotechnology, were you able to use these cells as little factories to make the Taxol for them, which I think is kind of cool. So, so the reason why I'm giving you this example is here's a plant that has really good anti-cancer properties associated with it. Also, there's side effects, but it's a very effective drug for certain types of cancers. It was not used in herbal medicine. It could not be used in the lab. So they had other forms of technology that were used to basically develop this. So, and again, it's another one of the drugs that's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. And so these are just a handful of plants or herbs that have basically been used for drug development. Some of these you could use the herbs, and the herbs themselves would be effective. Some of them, the plants are not viable options, either because of safety or because of availability. It would be hard to use the plants in nature. So moving on, we'll go into pharmacology next. Do you guys have any questions before I move on? So what I'm thinking we'll do is just take a 10-minute break right now. So according to my clock, it says 10:37. So why don't we come back here at 10:47? Does that work for you guys? Anybody? Just say hello. Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so we'll see you shortly. Okay, you guys back? Now I just was doing some testing. So I'm able to test it on my iPhone, and I can either look at the slides or I can look at myself. I can send little hearts to myself. I don't actually see the hearts on my end, but I think you can watch them on an iPad or an iPhone. It's pretty cool. I turned the sound down. So if you need to, you can use it on phones. You have to download the app to use it, but that's pretty cool. So I had a quick question before moving on to the next thing. Is someone said, I don't know who it is who said this now. Anyways, something about salicylic acid. Is it used as an over-the-counter acne medication? And salicylic acid can be used both for acne and for warts. It has an ascoriatic or kind of removes a layer of skin and kind of allows for tissues to regenerate underneath it and stuff. So it's kind of caustic in that form. One of the reasons why it also causes irritation of the stomach. Now, moving on to, I wish I could see you guys somehow, but I can't. Okay, so moving on, we'll cover some pharmacology stuff. And let me get back over here. So when it comes to pharmacology, this is basically a very quick overview of pharmacology and explaining how drugs and herbs work. When it comes right down to it, basically herbs are plants that contain drugs. And the only difference between a drug and a herb is basically if you isolate the active ingredients and put it in a pill in a really high dose, you have a drug. So the way that these herbs work is they'll interact with your body in particular ways, and we'll discuss that in a second. So just some basic little definitions. What is pharmacology? Pharmacology is basically the interaction of biological active agents with living systems. So basically, how do substances, chemicals interact with our bodies or animals? Pharmacognosy is a specific discipline of pharmacology that talks more about medicines that can be obtained from natural sources, and that could be plants and animals and funguses, even marine organisms. And this is basically how you study phytochemistry, so it's kind of neat, a neat area. If I was to do a master's or a PhD, that's what I would have done it in. But there's no way my wife would let me do a PhD right now. So that's never going to happen, but it'd be a really fun thing to do. I always wanted to go down and research herbs in the Amazon, but instead I just go down for holidays. So, and then another thing is toxicology. Basically, is the measure of how things interact in a negative way with living systems. And I would say herbal constituents have the potential to be toxic, and I would say they're all going to be toxic eventually if you take enough of them. And some herbs are more toxic than other ones. Now, with regards to pharmacology, something that we'll talk about is what's called the pharmacodynamics. Pharmacodynamics refers to basically, let's see if my pictures come up. It basically refers to how a drug or a substance interacts with basic receptors or enzymes or channels in the body to have its effect. And so when you're studying the pharmacodynamics of a drug, you're specifically looking at how the drug affects the body. So what it does. And when you start reading about herbs or drugs, we know that, for example, epinephrine will interact with the sympathetic nervous system, and it may have an effect on upregulating the release of things like dopamine or epinephrine, norepinephrine. Some of these things will bind to adrenergic receptors, or able to bind to other enzymes that are involved in making cyclic AMP and things like that. And so when we're looking at the herbs, there's three main ways that a drug or a herb can interact with a receptor. And I would say, to simplify, most of the therapeutic effects that we have in the body is when a drug or a phytochemical binds to some type of receptor or protein and basically either turns it off, or modulates it. And so an agonist is something that will bind to a receptor and turn it on. And so if you have, let's say, an estrogen receptor in the body, a substance like bisphenol, so BPA, so bisphenol A, it's what's called a xenoestrogen. It's an estrogen that's found in certain types of plastics. And when it goes into your body, it'll find estrogen receptors and bind to it really, really tight. And so here's, for example, an estrogen receptor in the body. And this is what bisphenol looks like when it's inside that receptor. It fits perfectly inside that receptor, and those little OH groups on the bisphenol are responsible for basically activating the estrogen receptor. So bisphenol, it's a toxic substance that greatly increases the risk of developing certain types of estrogen-based cancers, like breast cancer, because it binds to estrogen receptors even better than estrogen does itself. Now, another term is an antagonist. So an antagonist will bind to this receptor, but rather than activating it, it basically fits into that little space, but doesn't turn it on. It just blocks it. So it's kind of like, if this is the keyhole, it's like putting the wrong key in a keyhole. It'll fit inside the keyhole, but it won't actually do anything. It won't turn it on. But what it does do is it blocks other things like estrogen or bisphenol that would normally activate this receptor and prevents them from binding. So it shuts that receptor off. So kind of like, it's like if you had a door and you want to open it up, the estrogen opens it. Something like tamoxifen, which is a drug used for estrogen-based cancers, it basically goes in the keyhole and just blocks it, so you can't get the right key to open up the door. So you've got it. You can turn it on, you can turn it off, and then the third thing that you can do is you can be a partial agonist, or you can modulate that receptor. And so what that means, if I could skip back for a second. So here's your estrogen receptor with the estrogen. This is a steroid compound in there. It binds in there pretty good. And you can see those little dots signify like how close it can come to those little positive sides there and turn them on. If you put in a phytoestrogen, for example, this is genistein that comes from soy and also from red clover. It doesn't look that much like estrogen, but in three-dimensional space, those two little OH groups are able to interact with these little positive, probably amino acid residues that come out, and that turns on the estrogen receptor. But it doesn't fit in there as well as bisphenol does. It doesn't fit in there as well as the estrogen itself does. So it kind of partially fits. So it'll kind of wiggle around in there a little bit, sometimes turning it on, sometimes just sort of sitting there and not turning it on. And so while it's occupying that active site, it means that an agonist like estrogen or bisphenol can't bind to it, and it also means that other things like tamoxifen probably could potentially be affected by it. So something like a phytoestrogen, it partially turns it on when there are no other estrogens floating around in the body, and it also partially turns it off when estrogen levels are too high. So it has a sort of a balancing effect. And so phytoestrogens, for example, could be used in cases where in people where maybe estrogen levels are too high and you want to bring them down, or estrogen levels are too low in case of menopausal women and you want to increase it. We'll talk about it more in a second. So here you got estrogen at the top, there's a partial agonist at the bottom there, and then you've got a strong agonist like the bisphenol A on the right-hand side there. And you can kind of see, just structurally, although they don't look identical, you can see how potentially these things can fit inside the active sites. Another way to look at this is just something I drew up freehand. Here you have a receptor in the middle of the screen, and this is some kind of substrate that it works on. And so up at the top here, this little drug, when it binds to it, now let's call this, maybe this is estrogen, for example. When it binds to it, all the little positive and negative charges on the amino acids will cause the enzyme to change conformation a little bit. And then that can now open up the active site. So now that it's able to take, let's say this could be ATP, and now it converts it to cyclic AMP, and this now acts as an intracellular messenger to go and tell the cell to do something. And so this would be responsible for whatever the activities that the estrogen has. And that may be turning on stimulating breast tissue or building bone or menstrual related things. So now when you have an antagonist, what it does is it will bind to the active site, but it doesn't bind properly. It doesn't interact with all the necessary parts of the enzyme in the active site. And so as a result, it'll bind, so it blocks the estrogen from interacting with it, but it doesn't kind of help to unfold or to change the three-dimensional conformation of this enzyme to allow the enzyme to do its job. So this basically blocks off the activity. The third type, I'm just waiting for, my screen's a little slow there. The third type here would be something like a phytoestrogen that's occupying the active site. So that means that estrogen is now competing with it and it gets displaced, so it can't actually interact with it and fully turn on that receptor. And what's going on is the phytoestrogen is partially activating. It doesn't quite fit in perfectly, so the active site and then this site that's doing all the work, it's not fully released, so it can only do kind of a partial job here. And so as a result, it kind of maybe turns it on only 50%. And so it acts both to decrease the activity when there's lots of estrogen around, but if there is no estrogen present, then it's going to elevate the effects and sort of stimulate estrogen receptors as well. So it has both an increase and a decreasing effect. And it all depends on what else is going on in the body, what other chemicals, whatever hormones are in the system. So talking about basically these phytoestrogens would be an example of a modulator. Where would these be used in herbal medicine? They would be used to lower estrogen levels when someone's suffering from, let's say, menstrual cramps. So that would be a situation where you have excessive amounts of these, of like estrogen floating in the body. in a let's say a 20-year-old woman who's getting a lot of menstrual cramps, a lot of mood disturbances, her hormones are all out of whack, phytoestrogens can help balance that. Another example where phytoestrogens can be beneficial is with women who are suffering from menopausal hot flashes. So in this case, if a woman's, let's say, 40, 45 years old, 50 years old, 55 years old, they're getting a lot of hot flashes, phytoestrogens can help decrease the effects. So I would say if your hot flashes are like a 10 out of 10, phytoestrogens, I would say if you took estrogen replacement therapy, it probably would reduce, you could potentially have your hot flashes reduced to 0 out of 10. I would say taking like a phytoestrogen from soy, for example, it probably won't bring your hot flashes down to 0, but it might knock it down to like a 7 or maybe a 5 if you're lucky. So it modulates it. Another thing that phytoestrogens can do is they can protect you against breast cancer. So they basically will compete with your endogenous or the estrogens being formed in your body to reduce it so you don't have excess amounts floating around all the time. Or if you've got bisphenol that you've been exposed to because you've been drinking too much water out of the old plastic water bottles, you've got bisphenol in your system, it can help protect you against that as well. Also, because estrogen's involved with osteoporosis and deficiency of estrogen or a lack of estrogen can affect your bones, some studies show that soy and other things may actually increase bone density. And then finally, although we're talking primarily about estrogens, most of these phytoestrogens will also work for various male issues. So benign prostate hyperplasia basically means an enlarged prostate. And as men get older, they have the prostate just keep getting bigger and bigger, and eventually it affects your ability to pee, and you got to wake up and go pee a lot at night and everything else. And so this will affect most men. But if you're eating a diet that's rich in phytoestrogens, they tend to have a buffering effect and decrease the symptoms and maybe slow the progression of BPH. So these phytoestrogens aren't just interacting with estrogen receptors, they can also have an effect on certain testosterone receptors in the body. And again, as I mentioned, the way this works is it partially modulates these receptors. So flax in the bottom left, you'll see the structure of something called enterolactone. This compound is a lignin. You'll learn about more in the second half. It's a phytoestrogen. This is actually not found in flax, but when you eat flax, your gut bacteria will metabolize the lignins and form this enterolactone. So it actually needs to be activated by your gut bacteria first for it to have its effect. But you can see, again, when we're talking about those OH groups in the active site, this has them here. So although it's a completely different compound than genistein, which is found in soy, in three-dimensional space, it can go in there and still kind of interact with these receptors the same way. So if you look at, for example, breast cancer, what we found is that consuming flax on a regular basis, whatever the dosage is that they gave, it seems to decrease the primary breast cancer risk by about 18%. It also improves mental health, so it has an antidepressant effect as well, and it improves that by about 24%, and decreases overall mortality by about 31%. So that's pretty good just from taking a few tablespoons of flaxseed every day. One of the reasons why it works on mental health and also overall risk of death is it's probably going to interact with other things in the body. And we know that, for example, flax seeds are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, and it's also those lignins possess important antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. So it's not just going to help with cancer from a hormonal standpoint, but it can also reduce oxidative stress and heart disease and other things as well. Here's a study that came out in 2014 that basically shows that lignins, those compounds I showed you, help reduce the incidence of prostate cancer. So including these in your diet's probably not a bad thing if you're a man. Here's another study that showed, this was looking at isoflavonoids from soy and flax, I guess. Both showed that there could be some reduction in breast cancer. So those are just a few examples. Oh, and here's another one that just came out in 2016 that talked about how soy may protect people from the negative effects of bisphenol A. So it might help clear it from the body and have less of an effect. So in general, eating a vegetarian-based diet will be rich in these phytoestrogens. And so I don't see phytoestrogens as being a dangerous or a scary thing. I think they're actually a good thing. And when you think about if we were running around and eating a plant-based diet, lots of plants have small amounts of phytoestrogens in it. You'll find it in various nuts and seeds. You'll find it in certain legumes. Chickpeas will have some. Sesame seeds will have some. So there are phytoestrogens in the diet. Some of them more damaging than other ones. For example, if you look at men when they drink a lot of beer, beer contains hops, and hops contains a type of phytoestrogen. And you'll actually see that men who drink a lot of beer, they'll start developing breast tissue. And can lead to gynecomastia, which is basically the hops in the beer will stimulate breast development. So they get a big beer gut because, for a number of reasons. And it's not just fat that's causing that stimulation of the breast tissue, it's the actual hops. Also, too much hops can decrease libido in men, which isn't desirable. So a big beer drinker may have, may lose his sex drive. I don't think flax and soy does that. To varying degrees. I eat flax every day and I don't complain of that. Maybe that's too much information. And vegetarians in general, if they're consuming soy, shouldn't be an issue. But I've had men where they just live off of soy and they notice that their libido is low, so I've told them, maybe switch it up and go a little easy on the soy and try to have some other plant proteins instead. So I'm going to just check my questions here really quick. Jardine, what are you laughing at here? What do we need to know about the genus and species of each plant herb flax? I would say for the genus and species, they want you guys to memorize the common name and all the genus and species. And I haven't figured out how I'm going to do that for the exam yet. Generally speaking, I might focus more on that on the second half of the course. There's a number of herbs that we're talking about that you won't really use in practice, so I'm not as concerned about you knowing it. You certainly won't have to spell it out. If you had to know it for the exam, I might just give you, let's say, 5 questions and say match up the common name with the genus and species. Lori is asking, what is better, flaxseed or flaxseed oil? That's a great question. So when it comes to flax seeds will have fiber, it'll contain lignans, and it contains omega-3s. So you're getting fat, fiber, a little bit of protein as well, and lignans. So 4 main active ingredients that have beneficial effects. When you take flaxseed oil, you're not getting the lignans in very high amounts. You're not getting the fiber at all. You're not getting any protein. So you're only getting the omega-3s in there, which are good. So the flax seeds are going to have less of the omega-3s per weight, but they're also going to have other things. So they're different. You're kind of comparing, it's not apples and oranges, but you're comparing apples to apple juice. So they're different. I think it's good to take flax seeds every day in my diet, and I usually supplement with a fish oil because fish oils are a little bit different than flax seed oil. If you're a vegetarian, wouldn't hurt you to do both. Nicole asked, what are the effects of phytoestrogens in healthy males? I think that depends on the type of phytoestrogens. I think some of them are totally benign and help to promote health. So I think the average male probably should be eating more phytoestrogens than they eat. I think maybe hardcore vegetarians that eat a lot of phytoestrogens maybe should back off a bit and find some other vegetable sources that don't have as much flax in it or as much phytoestrogens. But I think it's also you can't compare flax with soy because soy seems to have an effect on some people, not other people. And one of the things that's interesting about these things is your gut bacteria will often activate them. And so research has showed that some populations don't have the same cancer protective effect from eating soy as other populations do. And that's related to the fact that they have different gut bacteria. So soy also, just as an appreciation, if you're eating soy, it's also going to contain other amino acids like arginine, which is good for the cardiovascular system. And so if I'm going to recommend a protein powder, I don't recommend whey protein ever for a number of reasons. One, it's a common food sensitivity, but 2, it's not as good for the cardiovascular system as vegetable-based proteins are. Plus the isoflavonoids, even if they don't have a phytoestrogen effect in the body because they're not metabolized by your gut bacteria, they'll have an antioxidant effect. They also have a blood pressure lowering effect. They also have a cholesterol lowering effect. So there's lots of other benefits of consuming soy. The only main issue I have with soy is the GMO issues with it. That Monsanto is a very evil company, and that's something I don't want to get on a rant on right now. Another question is, can women who are recovering from estrogen feeding cancer, breast cancer, utilize these phytoestrogens for menopause? So if someone has estrogen positive breast cancer, I'm going to translate this for Sonia, if you've had a history of estrogen positive breast cancer, is it safe to use soy or flaxseed for menopausal hot flashes? And I would say maybe. That's a very controversial issue. So I would say you need to look at the research on the individual phytoestrogen to find out if it's beneficial or not. I think flax probably is. Soy might be, but I don't want to say that right now. Usually I just get people to avoid them. And there are other ways that you can improve hot flashes. For example, instead of working on estrogen receptors, you can work on serotonin receptors. And so things like black cohosh and there are other herbs that can benefit hot flashes by working by another mechanism altogether. Okay, so black cohosh is safe to use for menopausal hot flashes, and the research supports that. Why would a modulator, which doesn't fit well, take precedence at the receptor? I don't understand why a modulator would bring levels of estrogen down. So that's a good question. So Brittany's asking, like, why is a modulator going to go into that receptor and not normal estrogen? And the answer is it doesn't take any sort of precedence over it. When you have your body, imagine if I've got, my hand represents the estrogen receptor, and I've got soy. Soy will float in, bind for a bit, and then it floats away. And then estrogen will float in and then float away. But while the estrogen's in here, the soy can't bind to it. But eventually the estrogen will float away, and then the soy will go in there. And then the estrogen can't bind at that point in time. So this is all rapidly occurring. So, you know, realistically in your body, some estrogenic effects on the body is probably based on thousands of receptors that are constantly being turned on or being turned off or being partially turned on by all these various things. And so let's say if your estrogen receptors are normally turned on at 80%, adding a little bit of soy to the diet may lower it down to 70%. Or if it's at 30%, maybe it'll raise it to 40%. So it just sort of balances it. It slightly turns it on. It tweaks it a bit. That's what the modulators do, is they tweak it. Okay? Does that make sense, Brittany? So it's not like they're more important or stronger or anything like that. They're all stumbling around through the body, and some of them fall into it, some of them are falling out of it. Now, some drugs are reversible, meaning they'll bind to the receptor and then they'll come away. And other drugs are irreversible. They'll bind to the receptor and they'll like modify it and get stuck there. And then you basically have to wait till that enzyme dies before, you know, the effects go away. And this is getting more complicated for oncology stuff. So Michaela asked me, is there a difference between ground and whole flax? Also between roasted and unroasted? I've heard that roasting can kill the properties of the flax. Those are couple good questions. Ground flax, because we're not birds and we don't have a gullet. So a gullet is what birds have. They eat little rocks and they're able to grind up the seeds. We can't liberate the health benefits of flax really very well unless we grind it. So if you don't grind up the flax, most of it's just going to pass through the system undigested. Okay, so you'll get the fiber out to some degree, but you're not going to get the phytochemicals, and you're certainly not going to get the omega-3s out. So grind the flax, breaks them open. Now you can get the oils, the good oils out, the lignans will come out, and more of the fiber. So that's good. The bad thing is now they're exposed to air, and because omega-3s are unstable, they can go rancid when exposed to oxygen. So once you grind your seeds, make sure you keep it in a sealed container in the fridge, maybe for no more than a few weeks or maybe a month. If you grind them and leave them in, like on your countertop exposed to sunlight, they will go rancid over time. Another thing is, what damages phytochemicals is heat and oxygen. So if you roast it, you're going to break down some of these phytochemicals and make them less active in general. So unroasted ground seeds will have the most amount of bioavailable active ingredients to it. I've heard flax can be dangerous in those with excess estrogen. I would say that's not correct. I would say flax is good for people with excess estrogen because it'll bring the estrogen levels down. You could argue that you want to be careful with giving flax to people that have estrogen positive breast cancer or other types of cancers. You could argue that. I'd have to look at the research and see what the consensus is. We may not know that at this point in time. So in an environment where there's no estrogen, in theory, phytoestrogens could stimulate, including soy, could stimulate cancer growth. So one of the big things I'll say is that in the human body, because it's competing with endogenous estrogens, it has a protective effect against breast cancer. If you already, let's say were menopausal and you have no or very, very little estrogen floating around the body, and you had cancer cells that are estrogen positive and you took a lot of phytoestrogens, then instead of reducing levels of estrogens, it could elevate a little bit, which could be problematic. So this is where the research is really useful, because one of the things with medicine is that something that sounds intuitively right may not necessarily be healthy. I could sit here and argue and say, you know, in private practice, when people come in and they've got low energy, I always give them sugar, because sugar is like the pure raw form of energy. And it's just, you know, if you got low energy, take 2 tablespoons of sugar, and that'll really help you. And I could show you the biochemistry of how glucose gets broken down to produce ATP, and that's, you know, and the mitochondria releases energy and everything else. And I can make it sound very convincing, but in actual fact, eating a lot of sugar isn't going to give you more energy over time. Even though there's probably studies showing that if you have hypoglycemia, you can supplement with sugar, and that's a good idea. Or, you know, and the chemistry makes sense. So research is important. That's why clinical trials are important to confirm our hypothesis. So the hypothesis that giving sugar to someone on a daily basis in high amounts will give them more energy would be false, you know. But it sounds convincing. Like I could argue that. And now I want to give you another example of modulators. And this is another kind of unique thing with herbal medicine. And you'll learn about these more, but I think these things are fascinating. And I don't take a multivitamin every day, but I do take an adaptogen. And what's cool about adaptogens is adaptogens are basically things that help the body cope with stress. And they've been used in Asian medicine for thousands of years. And so, for example, Panax ginseng, or just Korean ginseng, Chinese ginseng, whatever you call it, is probably one of the most well-known herbs, and it's one of the most expensive and best-selling herbs in the world, I would say. But there are other adaptogens that are also effective. Astragalus, Siberian ginseng, American ginseng, ashwagandha, which is sometimes referred to as Indian ginseng. And there are subtle differences between all these things, but the main way that they work is they modulate steroid hormones in the body to varying degrees. And if you look at the structure here, we'll learn about this a little bit more in the second half. The pink area that I'm showing you here is the main active ingredient. The black is just basically some sugars that are added on. And these get cleaved off. These are glycosides. But if you look at some of these things, astragalosides are found in astragalus. And this is a 6-membered ring here, and you've got this compound here is a steroid. I'll show you it in the next slide. So these are steroid-like compounds, and it's no surprise, like how phytoestrogens modulate estrogen receptors, these adaptogenic compounds have the potential to modulate steroid receptors in the body. And so if you look at this, you know, what are the main actions of adaptogens? Here's a bunch of steroid compounds. You've got cortisol on the bottom right here. That's basically what gets released when you're stressed out. And, well, that's not true. Cortisol is going up and down throughout the day, and it becomes even elevated higher when you're under periods of stress. And it's made from cholesterol. There are other things like estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone. These are all steroid-like compounds. And so when you think about what stress does in the body, it kind of basically, stress screws everything up in your body. It makes you sick. You know, chronic stress is bad for you. It is useful in the short term, but in the long term, it's not beneficial. And so when you look at all the benefits of adaptogens, some of the things that they do is they modulate inflammation in the body. They help the body cope to stress. They have some cholesterol-lowering effects in the body. So not really surprising there. Some of them act as aphrodisiacs, because if you've got low testosterone, then your libido is low, so it can help to boost up that. Some of these can work as a heart tonic. If you remember looking at the structure of digitalis, or digoxin, it's actually a steroid-like compound that has a specific affinity for the heart, but cortisol will affect how the heart functions as well. So these are very, very safe, unlike digitalis, which is dangerous, but they do have potential to be used for the cardiovascular system. And they also modulate the immune system. And so when you're stressed out, usually your immune system gets suppressed. And adaptogens, because they can modulate the cortisol response, can boost immune function. I don't know what all I've written down here. So here's a few examples of herbs. So astragalus is used in Chinese medicine primarily to boost immune function. It's also used, it can be used for edema, presumably because it has a beneficial effect on the heart function. It has a bit of a diuretic effect as well. It's often used, most of these herbs are, but it's often used to boost the immune system against viruses. So in Chinese medicine it's given to people during the change of season with some other herbs to boost immune function, because when we're changing from summer to fall to winter, those rapid changes in temperature and climate that occurs in the change of seasons puts a stress on the body. So even though emotionally or mentally you're not stressed, physically your body is enduring like a bit of stress. And that's when a lot of people get sick. It's not usually in the wintertime or in the summertime as much as it is during the change of season or when people are under stress. Siberian ginseng is another great herb. It boosts immune function. It has some antiviral properties to help protect against colds and flus. It also is used by athletes to help improve performance a little bit. It's not anabolic, but it does improve performance and helps to suppress or reduce the immune suppression that can happen if you're training at really high intensity. Ashwagandha is used in Ayurvedic medicine, often called Indian ginseng. It's used to help the body cope with stress. It's also used more for people that are stressed and anxious because it has a slight calming effect. It can also be used for insomnia. Just as an aside, somnifera means sleep in Latin or Greek, so the name of it kind of hints at the fact that it has been used to help people cope with insomnia issues. American ginseng, it has similar indications as Korean ginseng does, but Asian ginseng is more stimulating, while American ginseng, it's more Korean ginseng or Asian ginseng, it's more of a yang tonic. You learn about that in Chinese medicine, while American ginseng is used more as a yin tonic. So slight differences. They have very similar phytochemicals, just different ratios of them. I might talk about that. I'm going to answer some questions in a second. So again, when people get stressed out, ACTH gets released from the pituitary gland. That stimulates the adrenal cortex to release hydrocortisone. And if you think about it, what does hydrocortisone does? It interferes with reproduction. So, I mean, the way I look at it is when you're stressed out, your main goal is to run away from a bear and to stay alive, you know, or to get out of a dangerous situation. Making babies, digesting food, you know, that's not really a high priority. So those systems, in order to conserve energy, kind of get shut down or put on the back burner. You know, you want to wait. If you're going to make babies, if you're going to be pregnant, you want to wait till, you know, there aren't like tigers trying to eat your family. So, and so when men are stressed out, they may have lower libido. Women may have troubles conceiving. In addition, the other benefits of stress is that it changes the biochemistry to make more sugar and energy available and in the short term. So that can have a positive effect short term, but long term, that's going to increase your risk of getting things like diabetes because you're elevating blood sugar, or elevating blood pressure, which increases your risk for heart disease. Stress also causes muscle to break down, to liberate more energy. So in the short term, that might be good to give you energy, but in the long term, you're going to have muscle wasting going on. Plus, cortisol gets in the brain. It kind of makes you stupid. You know, when people are stressed out, their brains start turning to mush, and you'll see that a little bit. And then finally, cardiovascular function is affected by cortisone. Aldosterone also regulates one of the things that regulates blood pressure in the body. And so what's neat, the reason why I'm showing you all this is when you look at what these adaptogens do, because they modulate these steroid hormones and cortisol or cortisone in the body and aldosterone and everything else, it's no surprise that they're going to benefit people for almost everything. And so in Asian medicine, they're called panaceas, meaning a cure-all. And to me, I see adaptogens as being an awesome normalizer. And so in Asian medicine, they use them for all sorts of different illnesses and also to promote longevity. So some adaptogens like reishi mushroom, in Asian medicine, they refer to it as the mushroom of immortality. And so a lot of these are used to boost essence or help supplement essence, which is basically depleted with aging and stress. And so adaptogens help to keep you young. And what's really fascinating about them as well is that some of the research now has shown when people are stressed out, telomeres, which are involved in cell replication, they begin to shorten, and they're kind of a basically a marker of the age of the cell. And what they've done is a few studies using astragalus and a couple of these other herbs is that when animals get stressed and they're taking the adaptogens, it slows down or inhibits the shortening of these telomeres, which might indirectly suggest that it may help slow down the aging process. And if you look at people like they go through a major divorce or somebody dies and you haven't seen them for 6 months, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, they aged like 5 years in such a short period of time. That's the stress hormone. So I think that taking adaptogens just helps to balance the body, normalize it, and reduce the negative impacts on stress. And if cortisol is too low, it boosts it up, and if it's too high, it brings it down. And if I show you, for example, you may have heard of Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. So this is sort of a little bit of a simple version of it, where let's say December rolls around and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I got like 15 exams I got to study for, and you start freaking out. That would be the alarm phase. And so this alarm phase occurs for a period of time. All your hormones get tweaked, and you eventually get into this resistant phase whereby like week 2 or week 3 of December, your basically stress hormones are all elevated to enhance your performance to some degree. But if it's too high, it can actually work against you. And then if this stays on for too long, meaning, let's say not maybe a couple of weeks, but if it starts occurring for years on end or even months, depends on so many different variables, then you get into your exhaustion phase where you totally burn out and crash, and then your stress hormones sort of drop really low. And so this can be a damaging thing, but if your levels get too low, that can also be damaging. And I don't think it's quite as simple as this diagram, but because I think even acute stress, you can get like temporary exhaustion and low cortisol levels that can easily be built back up. But if it's going on for years, it can be challenging. So what I think the adaptogens do is, if this dotted line represents the stress response that someone might experience when they're stressed out, it sort of brings down these stress levels and modulates them. So that means that you're not burning out as quickly. You're not using up all your stress hormones, and the negative side effects of the stress has less of an impact. So maybe it helps to correct your blood sugar dysregulation, so you're not as likely to get weight gain when you're stressed. And so a lot of people that have trouble losing weight, if they're stressed out, they can't do it. So some adaptogens can help promote weight loss for that reason. Can also improve memory, because stress can kind of mess up your memory. It also, by reducing the impact of stress, it means you can go longer before you burn out and go into that exhaustion phase. So this is how I understand it. I don't think it's this simple, but because adaptogens are modulators of the stress response, you're basically getting, you're able to help the body cope to stress, and treats heart disease, boosts immune function. Cancer patients can take it to improve fatigue. People taking ginseng when they have cancer, overall, it prolongs survival rate. So people who take it versus people that don't live longer. They feel better. Works on everything. So these are going to be really neat for you guys to learn about later on. This is just an introduction to it. I take adaptogens most days because I've got a baby that's 1 year old that wakes me up sometimes a few times a night. So it kind of just helps keep my energy up and gives me more consistent energy. Unlike caffeine, which is a stimulant, I also love caffeine too. You really kind of, if you overdo that, it'll overstimulate you, and then you kind of crash. Adaptogens, you don't get a stimulatory effect. It just sort of balances you. It helps make you feel normal and give you more consistent energy. So going back to this modulating effect, if you have a stressed out person, cortisol levels way up, and this is the effects that it's having on you, is at 75%. If the adaptogen alone increases to 25%, when you combine these two, it's like you've taken the stress response from 75 down to, like, let's say 50%. So it's sort of helped to normalize the effects of cortisol. Now, if you're in that exhaustion phase and you've totally burnt yourself out and you've run out of cortisol, and now you're so exhausted you can't even get out of bed, then your cortisol levels effects might be way down here. Now if you add the adaptogen, maybe you've normalized yourself up here. So this is kind of like if a woman is menopausal and they take phytoestrogens, And this example would be if a woman has really bad menstrual issues because their sex hormones are way too high, this helps to normalize it. So these are all the different systems that you can see a beneficial effect with adaptogens. For the adrenal effects, so that's fatigue, you can improve athletic performance, diabetes, weight loss, various immune function, cancers, anemias, reproduction, hypertension, low blood pressure, high cholesterol, digestive effects, memory. So these things are pretty awesome. Big fan. Now I'm sure I have a few questions here. Okay, let me just look at my questions. Let me get them out of there. Question. If you were a vegan, would you take a multivitamin? Very random question, but I would say if I was a vegan, I would definitely take vitamin B12, and I'd also probably check my iron levels to make sure they're not low. In general, most vegans have to take iron and B12, and being a vegan is good karma, and there's definitely some health benefits, but there are some major challenges with it too. Which adaptogen do you take every day? I usually take a combination of Siberian ginseng and withania and Codonopsis. I won't give you the brand name because I don't want to promote any brands. But I also love Panax ginseng. Is awesome. It's one of my favorite ones. I find that's one of the more stimulating ones. You can feel it. It also makes you feel more virile. When you're a 40-year-old man like me, sometimes feeling a little more virile is great. It also just boosts your energy. You can feel it more. Some people find it overstimulating though. It's usually used not so much for your younger people, but usually for older middle age. So it's more of a stimulating one, while withania is more of a calming one. Siberian ginseng I don't find is overstimulating. I'm not going to mention any supplements. For younger people, generally speaking, astragalus is great to boost immune function. Siberian ginseng is also good for immune systems, good for athletes. Withania is a good general one. It has a kind of a calming effect to some degree as well. It kind of depends on what type of, what precise effects you're kind of looking for. The problem is some of them are cheap and some of them are very expensive. Good ginseng could cost literally $100,000 for a single root. So if you find a 100-year-old root on a mountaintop in China or Tibet or wherever, it could go for auction for a lot of money. In general, Korean ginseng is very expensive, but it works. It's very potent and stimulating. A lot of the other ones you don't notice quite as much, but they still work. Question, does the body become immune to adaptogenic mechanism over time if you are taking them daily for long periods or even for life? Should they only be used when needed? There are some people that believe that you should only take adaptogens for 3 months at a time and then give them a break. That's just all theoretical stuff. In Chinese medicine, I don't think they say you should take it only for a short period of time. I've been taking them for years on and off. I don't take them every day, but I take them most days when, especially if I've had a bad sleep, I take them, or if I'm under more stress, or if I'm training at the gym a little harder than I usually do. So I love them. I don't think there's a concern with that. Side effects might include like longevity, so I think it's okay. Do adaptogens vary with each brand? How do you know the brands you can trust? Oh, Lauren, that's a great question. Supplement industry is challenging. Even if you go into, like, different brands have different supplements, different quality for the products. Even if you go into Chinatown, there are different grades of ginseng. So you could be spending $100 for an ounce of ginseng, or you might be able to buy it for $20. So can't really answer that question easily. Okay. 1 second here. Okay, so some things with dose response I want to talk about briefly. When it comes to the effects that drugs have in the body, if this is 100% activity, you could have two substances that could achieve 100% activity, but they do that at different dosage because one's stronger than the other one. So let's say if 100% response rate is like death, or we'll just say death because that's convenient. What that means is, or maybe sleeps. Death seems a bit dramatic. Let's say make someone unconscious. I would say the first drug could be something like a barbiturate that at small amounts can really knock someone out quickly. While the second one, this represents a safer drug, and this would be maybe something like Valium would be better. And so those are agonists, but one of them's a little stronger than the other one. The orange line might represent, let's say, valerian, where it has a calming effect, but you're less likely to overdose. So if you got up to 100%, maybe this represents you go unconscious and suffer from amnesia, and you want to try to aim more into this sort of zone or this sort of zone. The orange one here is a partial agonist. There's less risk of overdosing and causing death because it's not as powerful, which isn't a bad thing. And the final thing at the bottom is no matter how much you give, it gives a zero effect. And so that could be because it's blocking the effects of other things. Another thing to be aware of is as you increase the amount of herbs that you take, it's not linear. So what that means is if I take 10 milligrams of vitamin C, maybe this represents how much gets into my blood, the blood levels. 10 milligrams, if you take 3 times as much, you might get twice as much going into your system. If you increase it by 10-fold or 20-fold or 30-fold, you might get another small increase. If you increase it by 10-fold again, you may only get another 20% absorbed, and it may start to plateau. So what that means in the case of vitamin C is taking 10,000 milligrams a day might be overkill in a supplement form, in oral, because your body can't absorb it all. And so, at least in a single dose. And so taking 100 milligrams or 500 milligrams, even 30 milligrams might have enough in there to prevent scurvy and do some other things. So taking more doesn't necessarily mean you're going to, taking 100 times more doesn't mean you're going to have 100 times the effect, because your system tries to control how much is going in and the effects that it has, and there's only so many receptors. The only problem is as you increase here, you could be getting more diarrhea over time. So if you take 10,000 milligrams of vitamin C, you're going to get diarrhea, and you're not really going to get that much of an improvement over 500 milligrams for absorption. Okay? So these things plateau. Now, another thing that I want to mention is pharmacodynamics, we were talking about before, is how the drug affects the body. Pharmacokinetics refers to how the body affects the drug. And what I mean by that is when you take a drug, it goes into the stomach. Some of it will be maybe absorbed in the stomach, or maybe it's acidified by the stomach acid. Then it travels to the small intestine. It gets absorbed in the small intestine. Then it goes to the liver. The liver metabolizes it, does some things to it. It might get pushed back into the blood. Maybe it gets pushed into the gallbladder, and then it gets dumped into the large bowel. Maybe some of the stuff in the blood goes through the kidneys, gets excreted in the kidneys. Maybe some of it goes to the lungs, and then we breathe it out, or maybe it comes out through our sweat. Different things that can happen. Maybe it gets stored in fat. So that's what the pharmacokinetic studies are. So when you take a natural product, your body's going to do something to it to get rid of it, because ultimately your body wants to get rid of stuff. It wants to take in nutrients and get rid of everything else. And even nutrients can be toxic. So if you take a pill at a certain time, you'll see the levels in your blood will go up, peak at a certain time, and that's going to be dependent on the drug and a whole bunch of other factors. And then slowly over time, it's going to leave your body. And that's usually going to be within a few hours, possibly a day. And so if you want to maintain the drug levels high in your system, you don't just take the drug once. You might want to take it 3 times a day. Some drugs might come with like a slow release sort of excipient in of some sort. But for the most part, you take a drug, you're probably going to have benefits for several hours, and it wears off because the kidneys are trying to get rid of it, the liver's trying to get rid of it, etc. So this we're going to talk about more in the next lecture. Now, a couple things that we talked about already is like what happens when you start combining things. Now, what's interesting about herbal medicine and medicine in general is there is something that happens where you can have synergy. So what synergy means is 1 plus 1 doesn't always equal 3. And now what I just showed you for the vitamin C, if you add 500 milligrams plus another 500 milligrams, it's not a linear thing. So 500 plus 500 doesn't mean that you're going to absorb 1,000 milligrams. You may only absorb, a total of 80 milligrams or whatever. So there is a plateauing effect. So when you combine things together or take more of a certain thing, you're not going to have necessarily a greater effect. But in some cases, what can happen is you can have a synergistic effect where one thing given in isolation has little effect, but when you combine it with something else, you have a profound effect. And so an example of this in herbal medicine, I'm going to switch over here. So I mentioned ayahuasca. It's just kind of a fun little example to give. Ayahuasca, here is being brewed down the Amazon. It's basically a combination of at least 2 plants. The ayahuasca plant, which the Latin name is there, and then another plant called chacruna. So if you give the ayahuasca plant alone, it basically is ineffective. It only works, and chacruna alone is ineffective. The two of them only work when they're combined together. And this is kind of neat. Now, ayahuasca is a brew, not like the combination that's been used by indigenous people in the Amazon for, I'm assuming, 10,000 years or more. And it's used in at least 4 countries down there that I know of. And it's widespread use. And how they ever figured out the combination, I find to be a little bit interesting. When you combine the 2 plants together and you drink it, it causes these profound hallucinations. Now, what's neat about this is the chacruna plant, it contains an active ingredient called dimethyltryptophan, and this is what your body naturally produces when you have a near-death experience or when you're dreaming. Now, this produces profound hallucinations when taken, but orally what ends up happening is it's inactivated in your digestive tract by an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. This same enzyme is involved with inhibiting certain neurotransmitters like serotonin, melatonin, epinephrine, DMT, also other biologically active compounds like tyramine, for example. It's a type of amino acid byproduct. You get it in fermented foods and some other things. And tyramine, if you were to consume high amounts of it, if your body didn't inactivate it, you'd end up getting basically overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. So what happens when you take chacruna plant by itself, the dimethyltryptophan that's in the plant is inactivated so that you basically have no hallucinogenic effects. It totally gets knocked out and it becomes inactive. And this is the process here using the monoamine oxidase enzyme. Now, what's neat is when you combine the ayahuasca plant with it, although it doesn't have any direct hallucinogenic effects, it contains another compound called harmaline. Now, just as an aside, harmaline is also found in passion flower and a couple of other herbs. And harmaline is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So it shuts down the effects of this enzyme. So what that means is when you combine these 2 plants together, it allows the dimethyltryptophan to be absorbed orally to have the psychotropic effects. So this is a synergistic effect where basically one plant doesn't do it, but the combination of 2 plants does it. Now, one other thing that's interesting is, for example, certain plants, whole plants, when given to people, are better than giving an individual component of the plant. So another example is Oregon grape and barberry. These 2 plants contain a compound called berberine. Berberine is a phytochemical that has antimicrobial properties. We'll talk about this later on, but it works on a bunch of different bugs, bacteria, yeast, parasites. We don't know exactly, but it appears to inhibit an enzyme called sortase that basically when these proteins are being produced from the DNA and the ribosome, it messes up how these are getting cleaved off and basically incorporated into the Golgi bodies. And so what's interesting though is that these plants show significant antimicrobial effects, but berberine given alone in a pill form isn't that potent. And so it's not that great in antibacterial or antifungal. And the reason for this is bugs basically have proteins called pumps. And some of these are called multi-drug resistant pumps or efflux pumps. And so what happens is berberine, the very structure of it, is positively charged, and it tends to just naturally diffuse through the cell membrane of some of these bugs because the inside of the bugs are more negatively charged. So berberine and other compounds, even quinine, will follow the same sort of mechanism, will flow into these things. But because the bugs know, basically bugs know a lot of these compounds are dangerous, it'll actively try to get rid of these things. And so you can never really get a really high concentration inside the cells to be damaging. So if you give berberine alone, you got to give a really, really high dosage for it to be effective. Now, these multi-drug resistant pumps, not only they're involved with bacterial resistance, but they're also found in cancer cells, in malarial parasites as well. And so a lot of drug resistance in general is because the cells will mutate and form pumps that will get rid of the drug that's having the effect. Now, what's cool is that barberry, Oregon grape, and even golden seal, in addition to having the antibiotic or these antimicrobial compounds, they have another compound that acts as a multi-drug resistant pump inhibitor. And so in the case of barberry, this compound here, which is the short form as 5-MHC, it's a flavonolignin that it does not possess any antibiotic properties or antibacterial properties to it at all, alone. So when you take this in isolation, it does nothing. It doesn't kill anything. It's a good antioxidant, but it doesn't kill anything. But when you combine it with the berberine, what it does is it inhibits these pumps. So now the berberine, so here's the pumps here. So now the berberine diffuses in and stays in there in high concentration and now starts knocking out the protein synthesis. And so what that means, going back to this, is when you combine the berberine and the 5-MHC, you're able to use a much lower dose to be effective. So berberine alone, not really that effective. The 5-MHC alone, not very effective. You combine the two, you can use like 1/100th as much of the active ingredients and have it be effective. And this is one of the research studies. This is basically what I've shown you, but I've made it look prettier by drawing it. But that's the premise. And there's a number of studies that have come out since this one. One last thing we'll talk about, herbal synergy with drugs. So what's neat about this is I know that barberry and these flavonolignans can help reduce antibiotic resistance. But I thought, you know what? Milk thistle also contains these compounds. I wonder if there's any research showing that milk thistle has benefit for anti-cancer drugs or other things. And what's neat is I found a number of things that show benefits. So milk thistle contains something called silymarin, or silibinin is one of the components of silymarin. And traditionally milk thistle is used for liver conditions. But what the research is showing now, it may have benefit for drug resistance with several different types of cancers because it's an drug resistance, and they actually have a beneficial effect by enhancing the effects of radiation. And so here's just a handful of 2013, 2017, where a lot of these are in vitro. Some of them could be human trials, but they're basically showing that these phytochemicals that are multi-drug resistant pump inhibitors are enhancing chemotherapy. So that way, if you look at people who go through cancer, the first round works, the second round kind of works, the third round doesn't usually work very well, and they're like, nothing else we can do. If we started giving these cancer patients milk thistle, what would be exciting to think is that maybe we could decrease the resistance to the cancer and make these people live long. An example of herbal synergy is Chinese skullcap contains a flavonoid called baicalin. And this compound here, it doesn't really bind drug-resistant strains of bacteria. It makes antibiotics more effective. So a handful of studies have been done with tetracycline, penicillin, ciprofloxacin, gentamicin. So one of the things that I in the future, I would tell you, if you're taking an antibiotic, take one of these multi-drug resistant pump inhibitors to make sure you don't get resistance to it. That would be a issue in the future. Rather than trying to do antibiotics, why don't we use new strategies to make the existing antibiotics work better? or still remain effective. And so this might be the solution for the rise of antibiotics. Not making new antibiotics that work by different mechanisms, because for them to work, let's form new strategies that use the old ones and make them work better. So this is exciting stuff, I think. And there's a bunch of studies there. And then another thing is, if you combine, one last thing I want to say, here's just using malaria as an example. If you combine, let's say, 3 herbs together in your formulas, they may be working by 3 different mechanisms to make it work better. So in the case of malaria, combining artemisinin with quinine with potentially a flavonolignin that works as a multi-drug resistant pump inhibitor, maybe you get the most effective and safest form of medicine than just giving mega high doses of quinine or artemisinin. What time is it? Oh, 11:55, about 5 minutes over. So if you are in the classroom, you can do whatever you want. You can leave. I'll just answer some questions now for some people here, and if you want to log out, you can. Now, what I'll say is next week we'll start at the same time, and I'll upload the lectures. Check it the night before at 11 or in the morning, but it's the same basic procedure. I'm going to try to do answer some questions. One question I'm going to just post up here, just so I can see. I'm just going to put a little poll there. If you want to just answer this quickly for me while I answer some questions, that would be great, just so I have a rough idea how the remote lecture went. So questions. Dana asked me, can you explain how adaptogens help with the imbalance of sex hormones due to increase of stress? One of the things that cortisol does is, because it's a steroid compound, it can, I'm not positive, but what I think it does is it modulates, or it acts as an inhibitor for certain steroid hormones in the body or receptors in the body. So it's kind of like what I think kind of what probably happens with estrogen and how it gets buffered or affected by the presence of phytoestrogens or xenoestrogens. I think cortisol just kind of can go in and shut down the feedback mechanisms or directly interact with steroid hormones receptors to inhibit them or shut them down. So that's what I think. And I think adaptogens basically are competing with some of the cortisol. Maybe it's decreasing the amount that's being produced through a feedback mechanism, or maybe it's directly binding to the steroid hormones. I don't know. Apparently I was breaking up for a bit. Apparently the milk thistle stuff broke up a bit. So in the last 5 minutes it broke up a bit. If you guys have questions on that, all that I was basically saying in the last little bit for the milk thistle was, I see that milk thistle, although it's been used historically more for as a liver herb, I see that has the potential to work in modern medicine to enhance the effects of chemotherapeutic agents like various anti-cancer drugs, and decrease possibly the side effects and decrease the resistance. So that's all that I was saying. And my hypothesis was, well, if it contains flavonolignin, maybe it works on these multi-drug resistant pumps, and it appears to, because it's the same type of compound. The other thing I was mentioning about the Chinese skullcap was it's used historically in Chinese medicine for infections and stuff, and it appears that it may help to enhance the effects of other chemicals, whether they're phytochemicals or whether they're antibiotics, and may help to enhance their effects by decreasing drug resistance. So thanks for your time, and we will see you guys next week. If you have any questions, you can email me. Thanks.